So welcome, Ken. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I think, Neil, you have to allow me to share screen. So I very much appreciate the invitation to speak to YQ&A, and I want to express my thanks for the great advocacy that you have provided on the waterfront. And what I want to talk about this evening is something that everybody who cares about our waterfront is very much seized with these days, which is the fate of Ontario Place. So I'm calling this talk a 50-year argument over the fate of Ontario Place, public space on the waterfront, found and lost with a question mark, meaning hopefully not lost. And so I want to start with the origin story and just remind everybody that Ontario Place has really only been there for a couple of generations. If you look back at this image of the exhibition grounds, which had been on the lake since 1879, of course, there was no Ontario Place. Lakeshore Boulevard was the edge. It was on the water. And to understand Ontario Place, you really have to appreciate what happened in Canada in 1967 with the World Exhibition in Montreal. This was one of the most successful World's Fairs in our time. It was a really great opportunity for Canada to invite the world to showcase all kinds of interesting new design. Many designers in Canada had an opportunity to work here, as well as great demonstrations of art, culture, architecture, landscape architecture from all over the world. And so it's really no surprise that 4 years later, the province of Ontario decided to pick up on that great expression of culture and design, and Ontario Place was created in 1971 in a really extraordinarily short period of time, picking up many of those themes. And the province turned to two great designers in our community, Eberhard Zeidler, noted architect who was developing a unique design vocabulary of advanced structures, which you see here demonstrated in the pods, and many other really interesting works in our city and elsewhere. And Michael Huff was one of the early pioneers from a landscape standpoint of design with nature, an ecological approach to landscape, world-renowned as well. And so I refer to this combination of the two as the machine in the garden, taking a title from Leo Marx, an American historian who wrote a book in 1964, speaking of the combination of the pastoral and the technological, which had occurred throughout the development of North America. And this was a great example. You can see here Michael's work, which was designed to protect from wind and waves and introduce native planting, and an extraordinary blending of land and water to showcase the work of Eb Zeidler. Eb Zeidler did this little sketch, which you see here, and it's very important that he referred to it, and that's the part I've highlighted, this as creation of urban parkland. He referred to it as a park. The idea of wave protection through landfill leads to the home of islands that can be used as urban parks, of villages for shops and restaurants, canals, performance spaces, children's play areas, etc. So this conception of Ontario Place as parkland was there right from the outset. And when John Robarts, who was the premier at the time when this was created and it was opened by Bill Davis, his successor, thought about what Ontario Place would be, he described it as a place where we could examine our history, look at our cultural and economic growth, and contemplate the challenges of the future. In short, he wanted a place to reaffirm our identity as Ontarians and Canadians. So it was all about Ontario and a showcase for Ontario. And you see these wonderful images of the forum, which many of us of a certain age had the opportunity to experience in Ontario Place. These are some images from the public reception. I'm going to talk about Ontario Place for All later, but we collected these testimonials from people who went as children, people who took their children, who took their grandchildren, and it was just an extraordinary opportunity to experience something truly different on the edge of Lake Ontario in so many different ways, clearly for all ages. And it was all about touching the water and being in touch with nature and experiencing this truly delightful kind of atmosphere on the shores of Lake Ontario. But what follows, unfortunately, was a period of confusion, of uncertainty, of neglect. After the initial success of Ontario Place, for the years after its opening in 1971, somehow the province lost track of what it was. And I will explain to you in a moment. I worked with David Crombie on behalf of the province and with Joe Pantalone, who was the chair of the board for Exhibition Place, on an attempted merger. And as part of that work, I just collected all of these studies. Here are some 21 of them, mostly done by firms that were doing economic analysis, accounting firms, trying to figure out what to do with Ontario Place as a piece of real estate and losing track of its central purpose, which had been described by John Robarts and by Eb Zeidler and Michael Huff as a public space, a public place, a park on the waterfront. But then I'm going to switch gears for a moment and to another really important thing that happened in parallel along with the creation of Ontario Place, which set the stage for a different way we were thinking about our waterfront. And that is the creation of Waterfront Toronto. And that really goes back to work done in the 1980s by former Mayor David Crombie with his Waterfront Regeneration Trust, and the idea that the waterfront really belonged to the people of the province, the people of Toronto, and that it should be clean, green, and accessible. And this came out of a lot of concern about the privatization of the waterfront and the loss of access to the waterfront. And that then led to the creation of Waterfront Toronto in 2001. Waterfront Toronto has been around for 21 years. It has succeeded through multiple political administrations at all three levels of government. And you'll, of course, recognize the figures in these images who have, different changes in who was the Prime Minister, who was the Premier of Ontario, who was the Mayor of Toronto. And yet somehow over the 21 years, Waterfront Toronto has continued to provide great guidance for the evolution of the Toronto waterfront with a commitment to community engagement, earning the confidence of the public, and a reputation for quality and a track record for sustainability and inclusion. And it has done that by leading with public realm all along the way, at the forefront of everything that Waterfront Toronto has done. And you can see that in some of the examples here. It has first and foremost, and often in terms of phasing, led with the creation of great interconnected public spaces, providing the public access to the waterfront of Toronto. And so this is a model at the bottom that Waterfront Toronto prepared, showing the transformation of the Toronto waterfront across the harbor, and then putting that in a larger context right across the entire Toronto waterfront, stretching from east of Ashbridges Bay heading over to the Humber, including Toronto Island and the Spit, and this grand ambition of opening up the waterfront to the people of Toronto, the Toronto region, and indeed the province of Ontario, has been pursued with great rigor over the 2 decades of the existence of Waterfront Toronto. And here you see some examples. The transformation of Queen's Quay, the winning competition plan. By the way, I was on the jury that selected West 8 and DETA, the 2 firms that actually executed the transformation of Queen's Quay. I remember when Queen's Quay actually had heavy rail, not streetcars, but heavy rail coming down the center of Queen's Quay, and it was all industrial. And what you see there today is nothing short of remarkable. And it has really opened up that whole section of the Toronto waterfront, which only keeps getting better and better and more interesting and more lively, due to much of the work that Tim Coker and the Waterfront BIA have been doing on the waterfront and reshaping infrastructure. And with the continuation of the LRT, which you talked about earlier, this kind of expression of the Toronto waterfront will continue east into the Portlands. So the next big piece of work, which is underway today, led by and delivered by Waterfront Toronto, is the transformation of the mouth of the Don. This was a competition. I was on the winning team with landscape architect Michael van Valkenburg. The $1.25 billion creation of this new redirection of the river, a parkland estuary on the waterfront, showcasing Villiers Island as a new neighborhood, and continuing that great work of opening up the waterfront to the public under the aegis of Waterfront Toronto has continued. And here you see some images, earlier images of that construction. On the left, you see the creation of the new river valley, in fact, the parkland, and an image on the right of what that will contribute to the public realm in Toronto. And what's really interesting is that Waterfront Toronto's assigned territory actually includes Ontario Place, and Exhibition Place extends right over to Dowling Avenue. So when Waterfront Toronto was created, it was given oversight responsibility for the area that includes Ontario Place. In 2006, 2007, I worked, as I mentioned before, with David Crombie, then acting for the province, and Joe Pantalone acting as chair of the board of Exhibition Place, on an attempted merger. And this really actually came close to happening. And we did some very preliminary design exploration of what that would have meant, but it would have meant the opportunity to provide a fusion, overcoming the barrier of Lakeshore Boulevard, creating a continuous band of parkland. And you can see from this image, even anticipating what was to come some 10 years later, which was Trillium Park, and the idea that the Martin Goodman Trail would extend not only on the shore, but actually extend out into the islands and make a continuous link on the water's edge of Ontario Place, and of course the greening of Exhibition Place. And so this idea of this as a great continuous waterfront park was very much in the offing. And what we were imagining, and this is the way we described it with David Crombie, was a consolidated lakefront park, a different kind of 21st century park, not just a conventional grass and trees park, but a variety of experiences, a gathering place, including recreation, entertainment, major annual events, theaters, marinas, art galleries, restaurants, heritage sites that would be a draw not only for visitors, but for Torontonians and from people from the whole region. And it would extend like an emerald arm, as we described it, across the entire waterfront. So this was an image of that idea of that green band integrating the two, and you can see the two traces for the Martin Goodman Trail, the one more or less where the Martin Goodman Trail exists, and the other extending out where it indeed does in the current Trillium Park, and linking across the waterfront and tying back, giving people opportunities to get right out to the edge of the lake, and picking up on all of the heritage assets, both the newer ones that had been created through the work of Eb Zeidler and Michael Huff in Ontario Place, but also the accumulation of all the great heritage legacy on the site of Exhibition Place. And so the plan was that this would proceed through a series of what we described as early win projects to begin that consolidation. And as you'll see in a moment, they actually began to happen even though we didn't succeed with the merger. These individual acts of connection and improvement, picking up on that idea of Ontario Place being parkland, had started to happen. There was concern in the vacuum about the possibility of an attempted casino, of condo development. The temptation every time there's a vacuum, the immediate answer is, why don't we put condos there? And Mayor John Tory was asked to do a report in 2012 to advise the minister to chair an advisory panel. And he did that, and he really very strongly came out with a direction that said Ontario Place will be brought back into the 21st century and over time as a new iconic public park that celebrates its connection to the waterfront of Lake Ontario. And here you see John Tory as chair of the Ontario Place Revitalization Panel, sending this letter to Minister Chen, making that really strong recommendation. And so here are some of the recommendations of that panel. Ontario Place must provide open access to the waterfront. It should be open year-round, not just for the summer. The site must be parkland. Couldn't be more clear than that. A state-of-the-art park on the edge of Ontario's Great Lake, a waterfront community, a place to live, work, play, and discover, and a new collaborative model with a range of revenue sources that would operate this new Ontario Place. And so picking up on that direction, in 2017, the first great realization was Trillium Park. And building on the remarkable bones that had been created in Ontario Place and had existed as the legacy of Exhibition Place, reopening the IMAX cinema in the Cinesphere, a renovation plan for the pods, and the 7.5-acre parkland named after Bill Davis opened in 2017 with a $30 million project that delivered this great Trillium Park that I think everybody has probably had the opportunity to visit, with the William G. Davis Trail, implemented by Infrastructure Ontario with the involvement of Waterfront Toronto. And these are just a series of images by just quite how wonderful this park is and how it has demonstrated how a refreshed Ontario Place could actually pick up on the legacy of Michael Huff and Eb Zeidler and repurpose these lands, bring them into a new existence. And this, by the way, was all done on areas that were service areas and parking lots prior to the creation of this park. So following that, there was a plan on deck for an expansion of what is Trillium Park, which you see on the right, into Celebration Common, which would have extended over to the west and would have continued that same design vocabulary of parkland, creating this kind of unique form of 21st century park, accommodating a whole variety of uses, leading over to the Cinesphere and the pods, improving connections to the park, the continuation of the Lake Edge Promenade, and so on. And with this in mind, in 2017, the province had announced this 20-acre park on the waterfront. There's another image of what that extended band of parkland would be, and an image of the opening up of the edge, which had been accomplished in Trillium Park on the right. And so this was an RFP to landscape architects to design this celebration common, the additional 20 acres of park, which would have been the size of 14 football fields of more parkland for open air cultural activities, festivals, community events, and recreation in downtown Toronto. And here's just an enlargement of that image, so you can see a sense of Ontario Place going back to the 1971 vision of Ontario Place as parkland on the waterfront. So here's where things got seriously off track in a radical new direction. So 2017, the province had issued this call for a design consultant for Celebration Common and the additional 20 acres of park. We had the provincial election in 2018 on June the 1st. One of the first acts of the provincial government was to dissolve the Ontario Place Board with the statement, the current state of Ontario Place is disgraceful. There is nothing that can be saved. We need to turn it into a world-class attraction. Nothing is off the table, and the site will become, and this is a quote, more of an amusement destination than a waterfront one. And when they said nothing can be saved, that included originally everything, including Trillium Park. The only thing that would happen, there would have to be some equivalent 7.85 acres somewhere on the site. So really scorched earth, tabula rasa. And in 2019, the Ontario government announced the beginning of a process for the comprehensive redevelopment of the Ontario Place site. So no longer a call to landscape architects, but for redevelopment. And so Minister Trabulo, whom you see here, made these extraordinary quotes describing the site on a recent site visit in cinematic terms. I feel like I'm walking through a Fellini film. He remarked on the peeling paint of the buildings, which had not been maintained. Basically, this saying that, calling it a disgrace again, and that everything had to go. And then Jim Janu, who was the reappointed board chair of Ontario Place, stated there's nothing that can be saved. And then in a moment of hubris went on to say, because it had to be rebuilt, it can be rebuilt in any way that Doug Ford wants it to be rebuilt. So it couldn't be more clear what the intention was. So then 2021, they did the RFP, the partners were announced. 3 companies were chosen, as was mentioned before. None of them had anything to do with Ontario anymore. If you think of John Robart's statement about a showcase for the province of Ontario, that was completely gone. So we have an Austrian company that was proposing a spa based on a model that they had done in a number of European cities. Interesting, when you look up the therme spas that exist today in Europe, they are all in rural areas. It's a very specific template. They're all surrounded by huge parking lots. They're all pretty much identical. Live Nation, an American company that was going to expand its operation even more, take over more territory, and Eco Recreo, a company from Montreal, which has since dropped out of its engagement with the province. So it's not clear what will happen there. But these were announced. These were the selections, and we were off in a radically different direction. And the kind of imagery that you see here of Therme, 10 acres of palm trees under glass. Hard to imagine something that would be more ecologically inappropriate on the shores of Lake Ontario. Obviously, nothing to do with our environment, nothing to do with Ontario. And on the lower left, you see the entrance to Ontario Place with this great identification of coming through a pavilion that is named Therme, with these enormous structures arising. And as you'll see in a moment, a rather skinny residual piece of public access around the edge. So the province has made much of the fact that there would be a $500 million investment of private money in capital on the site, but the $500 million is directed not to the remaining portions of the site, which would still be public, but to the 3 tenanted sites that these 3 companies would operate. And in addition to that, we now understand that the province would be required to spend some $100 million to prepare the site, to do the demolition, to do with the decontamination, to make the site available to Therme for their complete occupation of the West Island. So who is going to pay for the upgrades to the recreation facilities, public space parks on the remainder of the site, the residual part of the site that would be freely accessible to the public? But then the question is, who will go to these facilities? They all claim to be affordable, but to whom? We understand that the price of admission to the spa would be something like $40, that if you went with a family, not including getting there, not including the parking, this could be hundreds of dollars. What is the nature and the height of the paywalls to get into these facilities? How are the sites fenced off and for what periods? And how was all that determined with no master plan before the RFP invited these submissions? On the top are quotes from Infrastructure Ontario. One of them is, "We are listening. We want to hear from you," all the usual soothing words. But the problem is, this is all after the fact, when the key decisions seem to have been made and the deals have been struck, and looking for inputs essentially on refinements when the main design directions for the totality of Ontario Place are anything but clear. The idea that this is really the beginning, we are engaging with you, this is just the start. But in fact, it's not just the start. It's really the public process that's going on is really saying it's pretty much a done deal. We'd like to hear from you. But there is passing reference, if at all, to Exhibition Place. No real indication of any thinking or design on the integration, which should be a crucial part of any master plan, going back to the work of 2006, 2007. Very oddly and very significantly, the new intermodal station on the Ontario line, which is also for 15-minute all-day GO service and for the 509 LRT, which should be the way that many people will be able to get to Ontario Place. How would you get from that station and get across Lakeshore Boulevard and through Exhibition Place to these new plans for Ontario Place? Anything but clear. So here's the problem. There is a serious credibility gap between the words being used by the province and the actions that are being taken. They have gotten way ahead of themselves. The cart is before the horse. They are doing what's called a public realm master plan and a strategic conservation plan. But in truth, these should have been done, if they wanted to reach out to the private sector before the RFP was issued, to identify the sites and conditions where private sector involvement, as per what John Tory was calling for, would be appropriate. The sequencing is wrong, and there's really no strong commitment to the public side of the equation. And I think it has to begin with an acknowledgement, going back to 1971 and to 2012 with John Tory's panel, that Ontario Place is primarily and fundamentally a public park and a critical part of the Toronto Waterfront Park Network. It has to recognize that Ontario Place is an internationally recognized site and one of Canada's most important contributions to 20th century architecture and landscape design. And so I'm going to take you through something which is going on now, which Waterfront Toronto's Design Review Panel has been reviewing the public realm submission by Infrastructure Ontario and a team that they have tasked with doing this public realm plan after the fact. And it's really interesting how the contradictions are surfacing. So here's the cover of the first version of the issues identification that was submitted to the design review panel on July 27th. And it would have been hard to imagine a more unattractive image of Ontario Place to put on the cover, coming across the bridge to a closed gate on a fall or winter day. I guess, the messaging is, going back to the fact that it's a disgrace and there's nothing there and it all has to be redone. And I don't know how intentional that was, but that's certainly what comes across. And then the panel was asked to consider the following questions, and these are all good questions. Does the initial proposal, this issues identification, align with the original Hufsidler vision? Does it create a coherent, continuous public realm between the various proposed programs yet to be determined while providing for year-round public realm uses? Does it preserve, replaces, and improve the tree canopy? Does it enhance connectivity with the city through cycling and pedestrian infrastructure and improve connections to the Waterfront Park system and Exhibition Place, create a welcoming and friendly and freely accessible public experience and address equality in the design, addresses sustainability and resilience and future proofing? No problem with the questions at all. These are the right ones. These are the good ones. But does it do so? And so here are a few extracts from the submission. And I found this one really interesting. This was presented by the city through Infrastructure Ontario. And this is the city's official plan land use. And if you look at the different colors of green, you'll see that the more vibrant green represents parks. And the parks come up to Ontario Place from both ends. And then where Ontario Place occurs and that portion of Exhibition Place, we shift to another color, that lighter green, which is the same, is called other open space areas. And if you look at the little asterisk at the bottom, it says including golf courses, cemeteries, and public utilities. So a real reluctance to identify or suggest in any way that any portion of Ontario Place is parkland, even to the point of not acknowledging Trillium Park, which hard to describe it as anything but a park. It doesn't appear on this city's land use map, on the city's official plan as a park. So this shows the overall site. It shows the areas within the different colored outlines occupied by the three tenants and uses. And it shows in that kind of light green, you can see Trillium Park on the east edge of Ontario Place. In that kind of light green, the area that is left for the public realm plan. The top edge of that, the two green spaces on the edge of Lakeshore Boulevard are, of course, parking. And the indications were in the presentation to the design review panel that the easterly portion of that would remain as surface parking and the westerly portion might at some point become underground parking, but would be parking nonetheless. And then the question is, what is the rest of it? Where is the public realm, in fact, that is being studied? And how is that actually going to work? And then you see another tip-off, which is the timeline summary, where you see in that kind of tan color, the OPA and zoning bylaw application submissions for Therme and now for Live Nation with Eco Recreo off the table. But the public realm master plan won't exist at the time when those are already completed. And the Heritage Strategic Conservation Plan draft is not done either. So again, I come to this point about the cart being before the horse. These are really ex post facto rationalizations as opposed to giving real direction. This was a little diagram about opportunities and constraints, and I'll call your attention to the outline around the West Island, which is at the left-hand of the image, and there's that little dotted line, and one of the constraints is private program to navigate around. That is, that the public realm has to navigate around. So many of these constraints now are so severe and so significant. The parking, I mean, all these things, you really have to ask the question, is what will this public realm plan really be all about? And these two diagrams are really interesting, providing access to unique waterfront experiences. And you'll see that this kind of green swath that runs through Ontario Place, and then here's an enlargement you can see here running through Ontario Place, suggesting that idea of the continuous parkland relating to the western beaches, relating to Coronation Park, the Gore, and so on, runs right through Ontario Place. But as we know from what I showed you previously, that is anything but the reality. And so here, even more clearly, you see the delineation of this enormous structure, the Therme proposal, 10 acres under glass, pretty much occupying the entirety of the West Island, the expansion of Live Nation, and then now no longer the outdoor adventure zone, and we don't know what would come in its replacement, and the interim programming and event zone. And that is really interesting because that is meant to be what is left of the public realm. And I'm going to go back to that. So look at that, and you see Trillium Park on the right-hand side. And this Sunday, John Lawrence and Sean McAuliffe, who both write for Spacing Magazine and for our daily newspapers, organized a tour of Ontario Place, and they have been writing about all these issues about the future of Ontario Place. And this was the attendance at the tour. I'm there, David Crombie is there, my wife Etty is with me, and a number of members of Ontario Place for All, which I will talk about in a moment. And we were doing the tour, and if you look at the far left, you'll see those security guards, and you'll see a fence. And the fence was put up. We didn't know this, and I don't think Sean and John knew this when they arranged for this tour. The idea was to take people around what would be left of the public realm of Ontario Place. But for this event, which was a hip hop concert, that whole area of Ontario Place had been completely sealed off to public access, including closing the Martin Goodman Trail along Lakeshore Boulevard, including closing Lakeshore Boulevard itself. And so the idea of somehow that what's being called the event space being the remnant public realm and being accessible to the public, it's pretty clear what is meant by that, and it's not a public park. Now, I want to contrast that with what Waterfront Toronto is doing, which you all know very well, on the other side of downtown in the Portlands. And so here you see the plan which is underway, which goes back to that competition that I did with Michael Van Valkenburg. And at the heart of this is all the new parkland around the reshaped river entering Toronto Harbor, Villiers Island, of course, private development, but at the heart of it always is leading with public realm and public access to the water. And this is, you know, all the great trail system, Promontory Park, everything which is being introduced there. So the contrast, both of these areas being within the designated area of Waterfront Toronto, could not be more clear. So the question is, what happened to that bigger idea for the waterfront? And the question facing all of us is it possible to hold on to that earlier vision for this strategic park, and I'll keep calling it a park, as a linchpin in our emerging waterfront public realm? Now, this is really interesting. This is a study done by the City of Toronto in 2017, about the deficiency of parkland in the heart of the city with this extraordinary explosion of population, unprecedented, the fastest growing city and city region in North America, and the paucity of park space and trying desperately to provide it. And you can see exactly where that occurs and how it relates to Ontario Place. So that is what makes this even more poignant. This is a study that Ontario Place for All commissioned, really raising the question of the economic value of public space. This study was commissioned from HRNA, a firm that specializes in working with great public spaces throughout North America and the world. And they make the point that even if your only concern is economics, is the bottom line, you would never monetize Ontario Place as a piece of real estate as is being proposed, but you would see it as an economic development tool, as a strategy for an economic development strategy for the province and for the city, that in fact, the economic benefits, no matter how you look at it in terms of impact on property value, attracting jobs, attracting visitors, worker retention, equity and accessibility, this is what great cities do. They have great parks that do this, and they've done studies of all these great parks around the world, which have had enormous economic benefits for their cities. So even if one takes a narrow view, looking only through an economic lens, this makes no sense. And this is the reason why people want to come to great cities. So we're now, as I said, we're at that critical decision point. This is a period of enormous vulnerability with the allure of privatization and short-term monetization of irreplaceable public assets, that the abandonment of a unified park vision for this highly strategic public site would be a tragically short-sighted mistake, that the evolving park vision, which dates back 5 decades, is still valid. And it is needed more than ever, given our population growth. Its latent potential is even greater in the current context, but to save it will require powerful public support and commitment. And COVID made this even more clear. These are some images from people seeking solace, seeking to be together, seeking to be on the water with its unlimited horizon during the time of COVID, and with almost nothing going on from a programmatic standpoint. 1.4 million people per year were coming to Ontario Place and exploring it during that period. So you can't read the title at the top, but there are 3 things in play that the public can get engaged in. One is that review of the public realm master plan, which is being carried out by the Waterfront Toronto Design Review Panel, which will be seeing in public sessions next versions of that public realm plan. And they had very critical things to say in that first version. In fact, the minutes of their review will be online. The recording of the session is publicly available. Second, and very interestingly, the City of Toronto owns a band of land and water along Lakeshore Boulevard between Ontario Place and Lakeshore Boulevard, which gives it some leverage, as well as the zoning and official plan amendment. And finally, as I mentioned, the strategic conservation plan, which, even though it's being done late and after the fact, also has to be critiqued and has to be evaluated. So finally, I'm going to make a pitch for people to get involved, because if history teaches us anything, and we've had examples of successful public engagement that have actually turned around decisions like this, like the effort in 2011 to save the plans for the Portlands, what is currently happening in the Lower Don. Ontario Place for All, and there you have the website, ontarioplaceforall.com, has on it something called contacts, and I would encourage anybody who's interested to that's an opportunity for you to send a message. We desperately need volunteers. We particularly need people with social media skills. We're really organizing a full court press to try and involve as many people as possible. The World Monuments Fund has similarly stepped up, identifying this as a unique heritage set of heritage assets. The Daniels faculty at the University of Toronto is fully engaged in this effort as well. And I will end with that and hope that people are motivated to join this struggle.
Thank you very much, Ken. Excellent presentation, greatly appreciated, and certainly we support your efforts to save Ontario Place. We on the waterfront are well aware of the need for parkland. We're fortunate to have some of it here along the water, but we're also witness to the desire of Torontonians to get to green space and outdoor space. We see that in the summertime with folks flocking to the waterfront just to get outdoors. And so we certainly understand the need for parkland. It's a shame that we have Ontario, commercializing existing parkland and Toronto desperately trying to find parkland to the extent where they're willing to build a deck over the railway, at $2 billion. And unfortunately that failed. But here we have a city trying to build a park over a railway and spend $2 billion in a desperate attempt to get more parkland. But certainly, and it's only going to get worse. We see high rises going up, parks are disappearing all the time, and the density of the downtown core is increasing dramatically, and we desperately need more parkland. So a couple of quick questions for you. The agreements with the commercial proposals, are you aware whether the contracts contain significant penalty provisions for cancellation? That was my greatest fear during the Ontario election.
Ontario Place for All is trying to find out what is going on in terms of the state of negotiations around the leases. It's all very confidential. It's very hard to get information. And, one of the things we're saying is that, and I'm glad that Joe Mihevc is here, and he and his colleagues and Chris Glover and people at the provincial government as well, we need to make this an election issue. We need to put the issue specifically to all the candidates for mayor of Toronto. And it's really interesting that John Tory made such a strong statement about this being public parkland in his 2012 advisory panel report. And we think, this is, if ever there was a moment for the city to stand up and use whatever resources it has and whatever leverage it has, this is it. And I think you could just see from the crowd that showed up, from the work that, a lot of young people who are getting involved through the efforts of Spacing Magazine, of John Lawrence and Sean McAuliffe and others who are writing about it. We have to turn this into a kind of movement and make more people aware. And Neil Colgrass, I believe this talk will be recorded. I hope that other people will get a chance to see it, because I don't think many people are really aware of how strong a commitment there was that lasted from the inception 50 years ago until it was really overturned in the election of 2018, and we set off on this radically different direction.
Now we at YQ&A have worked very closely with Waterfront Toronto, and we commend them for their engagement. They have a reputation for working with stakeholders and engagement, getting public input, and there has been absolutely zero consultation on Ontario Place and engagement with stakeholders, and so that's disappointing. Any thoughts why Waterfront Toronto was not given the responsibility for Ontario Place? That it's, as you say, it's their territory.
Well, I think Waterfront Toronto has been concentrating its efforts, as you probably know, on the eastern part of the waterfront. It is within their designated territory. It's really interesting that Waterfront Toronto played a major role in creating Trillium Park, which is part of Ontario Place. And I think there has been this, I don't know how to describe it, this feeling of somehow let the province have its way with Ontario Place. But it's simply too important, too crucial in our view at Ontario Place for All to allow that to happen. And we would, and it's really interesting that the design review panel of Waterfront Toronto is now seized with making some recommendations around with the public realm, the review of the public realm master plan as a vehicle in making some recommendations. And I hope those recommendations will actually draw Waterfront Toronto into the fray.
So last question for you, because we are running out of time. We talked earlier about, giving the mayor of Toronto more powers and the city of Toronto more autonomy. And you mentioned that Toronto does own the land along Lake Shore and the water. This is the kind of thing that the mayor of Toronto should be able to veto. But yet it's not in the interest of the province of Ontario, so it would be beyond any of the powers that they're even contemplating giving the mayor, because it doesn't align with their priorities. Is there a possibility that Ontario could turn around and expropriate that land that Toronto owns along the water?
They certainly could. And the only way that is not going to happen is if this becomes so unpopular that the province is forced to reconsider. And there's a lot of speculation as to why one of the three proponents withdrew. That creates a very interesting opportunity. But I think it's a combination of looking at those three areas of leverage that I've identified, but also creating a groundswell. And it's really interesting that Ontario Place for All, the people who've stepped up are not just coming from the city of Toronto, and certainly not just from downtown Toronto. A lot of people are coming from outside, even the region, people who experienced Ontario Place as children or as grandchildren, or people who took their children or grandchildren to Ontario Place, who have really strong memories of what it was. And that idea that it be a showcase for Ontario. Margie Zeidler, I believe I saw that she was on this Zoom, made a lovely quip, which is, the province should stop calling this Ontario Place and they should rename it Any Place. Because the moment you take away any connection with anything to do with Ontario, it really is a very strange use of the name.
Well, thank you very much, Ken, for an excellent presentation, and we certainly support this initiative, and we will do what we can to help. Thank you again for joining us tonight. And
okay, thank you.
I can see from the chat that many folks really appreciated your talk.
Okay, thanks all. Good night.
Thank you.